Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this program brought to you by Kensington and Chelsea Libraries. Our guest tonight is the author Julie Anderson, whose rave-reviewed mystery thriller Plague treads plague pits and murky banks of the River Tyburn. We'll discuss the future of the political novel and the novel about politics, which are not necessarily the same thing, of course, in the 21st century. Julie was a senior Whitehall civil servant for a number of years, working for a variety of government departments and agencies, including the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. She's currently working on a second of a series of political crime thrillers featuring Cassandra Fortune, civil servant and GCHQ investigator. The first Plague, which we had the pleasure of hearing about from Julie herself not so long ago, was published by Claret Press in September 2020. We can expect the second, Oracle, to come out this year, and then the third in 2022. So Julie is chair of trustees of Clapham Writers, the charitable organization responsible for the annual Clapham Book Festival. So it's with great pleasure to welcome again Julie Anderson. Welcome, Julie.
Hello, Nina. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Nina said, I'm a writer and author. I was a senior civil servant for many years, and I worked in a variety of departments in Whitehall. Before that, I was teacher of English literature. But now I write crime fiction set in the world of politics and politicians. And tonight I want to talk about the political fiction and the political novel in particular, what it is, and where I see it going in future, even in an age where we have 24-hour news and anyone can be a social commentator. I believe that political fiction has an important and enduring role because it does a number of things. Next slide, please. And the next, thank you. Next slide, please. You seem to have got me. No, we've jumped one there, but I'll press on. My books are about Cassandra Fortune, the civil servant, as Nina mentioned in the intro, and she's the individual who appears in all three of the novels. The next one, Oracle, should be out at the end of April this year, and the third one, Opera, is out in 2022. They're all set in contemporary times at the start of the 21st century, and that leads us on to this slide, which is headed with a quote from the salutation, "May you live in interesting times," which I was always told was actually wishing someone ill will when you said that. And I could never understand it because I always thought it would be rather interesting to live in interesting times. But I guess when interesting means dangerous or chaotic, it gets rather different. And although we've had a period of relative stability in the West, really since the middle of last century, things are changing now. We have the COVID pandemic, which has swept the globe, and whilst our scientists seem to have found a way out of that, there are other darker human forces at work in the arena of politics, which we need to be aware of. You can see the photographs there. The one on the right with the police that's taken from BBC News was actually in the High Street of where I live. I live in Clapham in South London. And that happened very recently after a demonstration by anti-maskers and anti-lockdown protesters on Clapham Common. That's similar to the one immediately beneath it, which shows a demonstration in September of last year by anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, anti-scientists, science really, that demonstration. And then rather more recently, on the bottom left there, you see a photograph of the assault on the US Capitol. So I'm afraid, may you live in interesting times? Well, give me uninteresting any day of the week. However, it is all grist to the mill of the political fiction writer. If we could have the next slide, please. Now, the language of political has helped us define our lives. And I've got 4 examples there of phrases which are used in regular, normal, everyday speech. Big Brother, the ultimate watcher, the ultimate stealer of privacy, first appeared in 1984 by George Orwell in 1949. And in Catch-22, we have the ultimate paradox. It appeared in Joseph Heller's eponymous novel in 1961. The paradox that if you try to escape, you will make escape impossible. Kafkaesque is a word often applied to the nightmarish, the confusing, or the frightening. Very much the atmosphere found in the novels of Franz Kafka, like The Trial, The Castle, and The Verdict. And finally, Brave New World. Originally, that was a quote from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and it was a description of something very positive and forward-looking, something which Aldous Huxley took and turned into a dystopia in 1932. Next slide, please. Now we've got a definition, because where would a talk be without a definition? And it's the definition of politics. Taken from the dictionary, it says, the art or science of government and governing, especially the governing of a political entity such as a nation, and the administration and control of its internal and external affairs. It goes on to say, the actions or activities concerned with achieving and using power in a country or society. Now, the first of those definitions actually encompasses a huge amount. So all of the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, law enforcement, and so on is massive. But it's also very, very narrow as a definition. The second bullet there expands it slightly, but actually there is far more to political fiction than just those 2 elements. If we could have the next slide, please. So what is political fiction? Well, it's a story about political ideas, about political power, wherever or whenever that happens. It can also be a story about wider politics, wider than those definitions that we've just seen, about societal ills, the environment, the wider society, things going on around us in everyday life. It can also be a story about how politics works, its machinery and events, about an election, about managing a crisis. And it can also be used as a backdrop for a story which is focused elsewhere. Now, I would, for example, I would cite the Palliser novels by Anthony Trollope as mainly being of that type. Next slide, please. Now we have the first of those, a story about political ideas, and we have the covers of 3 of arguably the most famous political novels of the 20th century. Animal Farm by George Orwell, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And it's fitting that we begin with a book by George Orwell, who died 71 years ago this month on the 21st of January. Oxford World Classics are reissuing 10 of his works later this month in celebration of his life. And you can, if you've so minded, actually watch the launch on the 28th. It's on Thursday of this week. If you want to go to Oxford World Classics site, the launch of the reissuing of his work. Now, what Orwell said was, what I have most wanted to do is to make political writing an art. And since 2018, the UK has had a prize for political fiction writing from the Orwell Foundation. And this prize was won in 2019 by Anna Burns with The Milkman, which went on to win the Booker Prize, the Man Booker. And in 2020 by Coulson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, which went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. It's fair to say that pretty much all of Orwell's books were political, and indeed much of Atwell's writing. all prefigure the present day reality. Next slide, please. And there we have an example of the handmaid's uniform taken from The Handmaid's Tale, which has been adopted as a symbol of resistance to any of those who wish to restrict women's rights in any way. Those ladies are demonstrating outside the Supreme Court building in Washington at the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court last October. Next slide, please. But on this side of the Atlantic, we have probably one of the most literary or literate graffiti I've ever seen, found at Queen's Gate, Northwest 7 in London on Monday the 18th. And thank you to John Johnston for the photograph of it. It references both Orwell and Huxley and each of their dystopias. Orwell's from 1984 and Huxley's from Brave New World. And Orwell's dystopia was full of oppression, violence, fear and control of the truth, control. There was no privacy, there was Big Brother, and the violence permeates his book. Huxley's, on the other hand, is very much about a society in which the people are enthralled to their own pleasures. They have so much information they cannot tell which is truth, and they are perennially distracted by the trivial, by drugs and pleasure, and are therefore easily manipulated and controlled. So, is it the boot on the face or the pill and the palliative? The graffiti artist clearly thinks that the pill and the palliative, or Huxley's Brave New World, is more relevant now. I think actually it depends where you are in the world. I think if you were in China or in Hong Kong, it would be Orwell's dystopia you'd be more worried about. And the really scary thing, of course, is that they're not mutually exclusive. Both could happen at once. Next slide, please. Now, Orwell was actually taught by Huxley for a brief period when he was at Eton. Huxley was a teacher there for a year. He was teaching French, of all things. And Huxley congratulated Orwell, published in 1984. He wrote to him and he said this: "The lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience." Huxley appreciated 1984, but he thought his own dystopia was a little more relevant. He certainly saw the importance of new technology in societies which were susceptible to persuasion, and the dangers of promoting politicians to the public like marketable commodities. However, not all political fiction is about power and systems of control. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, we had the great campaigning or reformist novels to expose the ills of society and to promote change. Now, Sam Leith, who was recently a judge of the Orwell Prize for political fiction, described and categorised these novels as, "Look at this, isn't it appalling?" And whilst I have some sympathy with that view, I think we shouldn't ignore the impact that some of these novels have had. So a novel like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe, is now much derided for its paternal racism, but it was regarded as a hugely influential abolitionist book at the time and influenced both the abolitionist movement in the States and the general public. Similarly, the book that's on the right there, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Trussell, which was published in 1914, was very influential on the growing socialist movement in the UK, and is one of the most oft quoted books as influencing their readers. You could take a book that's not on that screen there, A.J. Cronin's The Citadel, which was published in 1937. This novel followed a junior doctor in a South Wales mining village, and it was widely regarded as influencing Aneurin Bevan, who of course later went on to set up the NHS. Now, Cronin's novel showed the medical profession as it was then in all its vicissitudes, well-meaning but not so scientific as today, and dealing with horrendous problems in the pit villages of South Wales in terms of health. And whilst it might have influenced Aneurin Bevan for the better, it was also used by the Third Reich. Nazi Germany quoted it as an example of how poor conditions were in the UK. Now, you could say, well, where are the campaigning novels of the 21st century? And I think that we still have novels which wish to expose ills and to promote change, but they don't wear their hearts on their sleeve quite as much as their predecessors did. And I wonder whether this isn't a tenor of the times we live in. We want something that is more complex and more dark. It's a bit like how society has fallen out of love with love at first sight. You never come across the coup de foudre in a novel these days, and yet the 19th century novels are full of it, the glancing across a crowded room, etc., etc. It very rarely happens in novels now. Next slide, please. But some novels can be regarded as political novels, even when they're something else as well. And here we have three love stories. Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which is actually marketed as the classic love story. For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway, and A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Now, interestingly, way back in the late 17th century, Pierre Daniel Huet, who was one of the writers of the first history of the novel, or the roman as it was then called, said this: novels have love as their principal subject. They deal only incidentally with politics and war. And I can see what he means in terms of where the reader's sympathy lies. If you take a novel like War and Peace, do we really care about who wins at the Battle of Borodino? No, I don't think so. We care about Pierre and Natasha. But there's also Orwell's remark when he said, there's no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues. And that, of course, would include love. Now, one of the things that's notable about these three books is that they are love stories. They are all set at times of huge political upheaval. The American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and the French Revolution. So these were set in interesting times also. And political events shape these novels and the characters within them. But there are also the politics of relationships. And of course, one has to consider that since all of these were written, you have the feminist critique of power politics that that are part of the personal and intimate of our private lives. Next slide, please. So, a recap on what is political fiction. A story about political ideas, like those of Orwell, Huxley and Atwood. A story about the wider politics, like the campaigning stories and novels of the 19th century. But there can also be stories about how politics works. Next slide, please. How politics works and how individuals make politics work for them. These novels are about the getting and the keeping of power. On the left there you have Michael Dobbs' House of Cards. Michael Dobbs was himself a Tory insider. He was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party under John Major and was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He was, I think the Guardian called him the Conservative Party's baby-faced assassin, or words to that effect. But his novel was first adapted in the 1980s for a BBC BAFTA-winning series and has subsequently got a new lease of life through the US Netflix series starring Kevin Spacey. And that's very much about the getting and the keeping of power. In that case, it's either the prime ministerial or presidential top job. And it's set in the modern day democracy. But you don't have to set these books in the contemporary times. The middle one there, Robert Graves' I, Claudius and Claudius the God, is set at about 1 BCE. And of course, Wolf Hall on the right, by Hilary Mantel, the first of her three remarkable books following the career of Cromwell in 16th century Royal England, is about exactly that. The one in the middle is more interesting because it's actually between the two, even though those two novels are set in ancient Rome, ancient imperial Rome. When the first novel opens, I, Claudius, Augustus has only just assumed the top job, and many of the characters look back longingly to Republican Rome, democratic Rome, where the Senate ruled. And the early part of that novel does show how Augustus hollowed out the institutions that belonged to that previous democracy, whilst accreting more and more power to himself. Next slide, please. Stories about elections are very popular, especially in the US. I did some research for an article I wrote back in 2018 about books written about elections, and there were some interesting facts that came out of it. I would have thought that there were a lot of books about elections because they are such dramatic events. They have inbuilt tension, they have inbuilt suspense. But the books here on the left, you see Primary Colours, which was published anonymously as a novel of politics in 2010, but is actually based on Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, and it was written by Joe Klein, who is a Washington insider. And his narrator is a fellow called Henry Burton, and that name references the narrator in the book on the right, Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. That was published in 1946, and it follows the campaign of a Southern governor, Willie Stark, in his attempts to reach power. The narrator in that book is called Jack Burden. Now, All the King's Men actually won the Pulitzer Prize of its time, and it also was made into an Oscar-winning film that won Best Film at the Oscars a couple of years after the book came out. The one in the middle is Dan Brown, because one has to have Dan Brown somewhere in a story about politics, because he writes so many stories that are set in the Washington Beltway. This one I've chosen is actually set in Rome, but it is about an election. In this case, it's a papal election. Now, what I found quite strange is that when I was researching the article, there were lots and lots of novels about American elections, but very few British novels. I was able to trace a couple. There's Melancholy by Thomas Love Peacock, which was published in 1817, and Phineas Redux, one of Trollope's Palliser series, which tells the story of an election and about election fraud. And I suppose there's Chris Mullin's A Very British Coup, which was set immediately after a general election. But those are the only British ones I could find. If any of you know of any more, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know, so that if I do this talk again at any time, I can actually supplement it by more English or British examples of political fiction set around elections. Next slide, please. Now, one of the subsets of political fiction is the politics of espionage. The spy novel is a genre all of its own, so I don't really want to touch on that. But many spy novels also deal with politics in a broader sense. And almost anything by John le Carré includes some sort of references, usually in the characters' beliefs and backgrounds, to political systems east and west. The example I've chosen here is John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. But Robert Harris, in the book in the centre of the screen now, An Officer and a Spy, that book is actually based on the Dreyfus affair in 19th century France. And a slightly more up-to-date book there, Jane Thinn's Black Roses. Now, her spy is not a professional spy at all. She's an English woman who happens to be living in Berlin in the 1930s and gets involved with both politics and the rise of the Nazi Party. Next slide, please. Now, a well-defined subset of political fiction is the subset of crime, and it's one in which I would bracket my books. You've got 3 on screen there, which were all published in 2020, so they're all very contemporary. On the left you have mine, entitled Plague. In the middle, there's one by Simon Burton, who is an award-winning filmmaker and journalist, so knows his way around Whitehall and Westminster. And then on the right, The House, written by Tom Watson with Imogen Robertson. Tom Watson, of course, was a former deputy leader of the Labour Party. All 3 of these deal with corruption and/or crime in high places and the lust for power, and that is frequently the theme for the Westminster Thriller or the Westminster crime novel. Next, please. And that's also the case with its US equivalent, the Washington Thriller. And you've got 3 there, good examples: The Brethren by John Grisham, and The Race by Richard North Patterson, and Farragut North by Beau Willimon. Willimon was another Washington insider. Farragut North is actually the name of the metro station in that part of Washington DC where all the think tanks and lobby groups are based. It was turned into a film with George Clooney and Ryan Gosling not so long ago, actually, called The Ides of March. And Beau Willimon, who wrote Farragut North, is now cited as one of the executive producers on The House of Cards, the American version of the novel that we've already discussed. And you can see that by and large, these sort of Westminster or Washington thrillers are written by insiders, either MPs or former MPs like Tom Watson, Michael Dobbs, Chris Mullin, and including former cabinet ministers like Douglas Hurd and Edwina Currie, or by people who worked in the Beltway or in Whitehall like Joe Klein, or indeed like me. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to give you a personal view about how I weave politics into the fiction that I write. I write crime fiction set in the world of politics, not the novels of ideas. But when I'm writing a novel, when I begin to write it, I always look for an idea or a theme to begin with. So, and my publisher will kill me for saying this, because she always says that plot is the bedrock of detective and mystery stories. I don't actually start with plot. I start with a theme or a concept. So, for example, in Plague, my concept or theme was power. That was the filter through which all the events and interactions and relationships in the book had to be viewed. I wanted to take Foucault's idea of power being in everything and everywhere, and that allowed me to consider the individual's need for self-agency and control. My protagonist, Cassandra Fortune, has lost a degree of control in her career. She had to leave her previous post under a cloud, and much of the drive in Plague is to do with her need to get that control back. For some, of course, control and power means dominance, and ultimately that leads to the series of crimes which form the plot of that book. In Oracle, my theme is justice, and that goes from the very ancient ideas of justice and blood retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, to modern legal systems of justice and of jurisprudence, and of the institutions which support it, like the police, for example. Now, these are universal themes or concepts, but you could take something much more specific. George Orwell said this: "My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice, some lie I want to expose," and that was in his essay, Why I Write. An example of that is actually last year's winner of the George Orwell Prize for Political Fiction, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, because he takes a demolished boys' school as a manifestation or a microcosm of the whole of the US, and shows how in that school events that were deeply entrenched in the school was deeply entrenched in racism and racist attitudes to the time, and how that fed itself just as it does in the US today. Another example of that, though it's not in English fiction, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's cancer ward, when he made his hospital ward an example or in microcosm of the whole of the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. Now, of course, in crime fiction, as in any fiction, you have to have a resolution to the novel. And in crime fiction, it's often, is the killer caught? Is the case solved? Of course, it must be. People who read crime fictions are, by and large, justice seekers. In political crime fiction, the question is, does the government fall? Is the terrorist plot uncovered? But in the more reformist novels of the 19th century, frequently you had this play out within the characters. So in Nicholas Nickleby, the cover of which we saw earlier, you have Ralph Nickleby, evil man of business, who commits suicide at the end of the book because it is brought home to him in very personal terms how his credo has impacted upon his own life. But rarely is the outcome in those books or in modern books a change in the political system. In Plague, we see some of the laws changed around corruption and the interconnections between Parliament, finance and business. But usually institutional reform is not the subject of page-turning novels. So you have to stay within the bounds of the possible, unless, of course, you're writing a speculative fiction. And that, of course, is why Animal Farm, The Handmaid's Tale and Brave New World are speculative fiction, amongst other things, amongst other reasons. I rather like the modern mechanism of having alternative endings. And one of the very best ones that I've come across was actually in a film, not in a book, though it was a film of a book. The book, was The Big Short, published in 2011 by Michael Lewis. It was a bestseller, and it was about the financial crash of 2008. In the film, one of the main characters gives two alternative endings. First of all, the capitalist system is reformed to make it more socially equitable, and the wealthy wrongdoers are sent to jail. In the second, everything gets swept under the carpet, the little guy pays, and the wrongdoers go back to business as usual fairly quickly. I think we know which one applied. Next slide, please. So, what are other focuses for narratives? I just stated one, that's film. And there are lots and lots of other media which are competing with the novel today to tell a political story. You could easily say that the novel is no longer the dominant form of storytelling these days. You have film, you have TV, you have games, you have a mashup of all three. You also have the rise of non-fiction storytelling, faction or true crime, the grandfather of which was supposedly In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, though there were in fact earlier versions of that. And that has achieved a respectability in recent years, which it hadn't used to have. So much so that in 2008, the Samuel Johnson Prize was actually given to a true crime book. It was Kate Summerscale's The Suspicion of Mr. Witcher, which actually looked at a real Victorian murder case. You also have the non-fiction manifesto of political ideas, which is again in vogue. I mean, the granddaddy of them all, of course, was the Communist Manifesto of 1848. But in recent years, you've had Post-Capitalism by Paul Mason, Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, or slightly differently, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. I suspect that if Robert Tressel was writing the Ragged Trousers Philanthropists today, he'd be writing a sort of non-fiction manifesto rather than a novelized version of Marxist theory. And of course, the other thing to take into account today is that we're all citizen journalists. We have 24-hour news, The political blog is a 21st century phenomenon, and anyone can become a political commentator. You just have to be in the right place at the right time. Next slide, please. So what does political fiction offer that these other things don't? Well, I think that it offers us stories about power in speculative or other fiction, which actually allow us to experience what it means to seek that, have that sort of ambition, and what that sort of ambition can do to individuals. The fictional narrative doesn't have to be overtly about political systems. It can also be about politics on a personal level. And I think too that it helps us understand and make sense of our world. Animal Farm was originally called Animal Farm, a fairy story. And I think that, like the fairy tales and the folk tales that we were told as children, which helped us develop our cognitive and reasoning skills, political fiction help us make sense of the world around us. They use fictional lived experience to allow us to see what political choices actually mean in real terms. So, for example, The Milkman, which was an Orwell Prize winner, shows the impact of the Troubles on ordinary lives in Northern Ireland. These are stories of personal identity that show the fault lines and the tensions in communities, all of which result from political decisions at one level. Next slide, please. So in summary, I would say political stories have a gripping relevance. They are centre stage in interesting times, and I think that's what we're living through now. And so political fiction is more relevant than ever. And like Tressel's house painters in The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, who understand that they are being exploited and how, when the narrator divides up their bread, we learn and increase our understanding by reading these sort of stories. Next slide, please. And just to leave you with this list from the Orwell Prize 2020. This is the long list of novels which I've categorised in various types, though in fact they could all be described as state of the nation novels. And you can see the huge range that is now available to us in political fiction. So something like Spring by Ali Smith, or The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy, looking at where we are in the UK in the 21st century. Or The Travellers by Regina Porter, or The Topeka School by Ben Lerner, doing the same for the USA. There's Edna O'Brien's Girl, which was a response to a specific event. She follows the story of one of the girls who was kidnapped. If you remember the occasion in Nigeria when the Boko Haram kidnapped an entire class of girls. We still have our dystopias, and we have The Wall by John Lanchester, which describes an island nation which builds a wall around its coast. You can imagine that the ideas and issues with which that deals. And we have novels addressing specific issues like Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, winner of the Booker Prize, which addressed the lack of black female characters in literature. And The Nickel Boys, which I've already mentioned, by Colson Whitehead. If you prefer short stories, why not try Broken Jaw by Manoli Salgado? Those are a set of stories set in Sri Lanka that deal not only with the Sri Lankan Civil War, but what that means a couple of generations later on the island. And also This Paradise by Ruby Cowley, about a set of stories about people who are fleeing to seek a new life. There's historical political fiction, To Calais in Ordinary Times by James Meek, which is set during a different pandemic, the outset of the onset of the bubonic plague in the 14th century. And finally, a crime writer, because I'm a crime writer, Heaven My Home by Attica Locke, which looks at how a Texas Ranger searches for a missing boy and has to deal with his white supremacist family and their prejudices. So, some excellent political fiction, and it's available now. I suggest too that you, if you're interested in reading any of those books, you also look at the Orwell Longlist Prize for 2019, because there are some excellent books on there. Next slide, please. And then to me, and that's my book, Plague. It's not a big a book of political ideas, but it does have political ideas in it. It's published by Claret Press, and it retails at £9.99. You can buy it on bookshop.org or Amazon, or via the Claret Press website, given that most bookshops, of course, are no longer open. You can also find it in the libraries of Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. And if you go onto my website, and there's the address, you will see that I've done a blog about this talk this evening, at the end of which is a reading list that lists all the books mentioned tonight. Next slide, please. And because I can't fail to tell you about my next book, which is Oracle, and that's the book that deals with various kinds of justice. It's set in Delphi in Greece, and there's a very atmospheric photograph of the Temple of Apollo there. It's out in spring, and you can find it in the shops at the end of April, start of May. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that that's stimulated your appetite for reading some political fiction, and I'll happily take questions if I hand you back to Nina now.
Thank you, Julie. That was wonderful, wonderfully interesting, I must say. I found myself riveted. You mentioned some of my favorite novels, almost of all time, in your talk, and it seems it has whetted the appetite of our audience, because we have quite a few questions. So let me start with the first one that came through. This is from Stella. What did you think of Tom Watson's book? If you've read it, of course.
I haven't, I have to confess, mainly because I have been writing Oracle, and I can't read the similar sort of books to my own when I'm writing, because I find that the author's voice comes through out in my pen. So I haven't yet read it. I have got it, and I've actually spoken to Imogen, who worked with Tom on writing it. So I have it here, and I am waiting to read it once I've got Oracle off to my publishers.
Okay, so you don't want your thought processes contaminated by somebody else's ideas?
Well, I'm not sure it's contaminated, but...
Cassia wants to know, did your career in civil service steer you towards writing political novel?
To an extent, I think that's true. It did. Because it's the world I inhabited for nearly 30 years, and people say that Westminster and Whitehall is a village, and it does feel very much like that, a little bubble in which you exist. So it became very obvious to me when my publisher asked me to write a crime fiction that I should set it in that milieu, because it was a world that I knew extremely well.
That's very interesting, because there was another question which I can't find now, so I'll paraphrase it. Somebody said, could an outsider have written the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy novel, which is so fascinating in its detail, in its ordinariness, but then also in this veracity of how it depicts the world that it does. It feels like you have to be an insider to a degree to be able to even conjure up this world in your imagination.
I'm not so sure, actually. I think that sells the power of imagination short. I think that we can imagine things very, very strongly. I think it's easier if you know the world you're writing about, because you can give all sorts of insights that someone who has not been inside that world simply wouldn't have, and things that they wouldn't know. Why should they? But the power of the imagination is an incredibly strong thing. I've just finished, well, some while ago now, because I'm still writing, but a book by Chris Whitaker called We Begin at the End, which is set in Southern California, and I found extremely persuasive the picture that he paints. I was astonished when I looked at the back of the book and found that Chris Whitaker lives in Hertfordshire. He's British, he's not Californian, and yet he gets the milieu and the tone and the speech perfectly right. So, you know, I think good writers and the power of the imagination can do remarkable things.
It makes me think of Hieronymus Bosch, who, if you've ever seen his Garden of Earthly Delights, who, when I read that he actually practically never left his manor, which was, you know, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. He was just totally asocial, and you think, where did he get all of that stuff from? And he was even yes, and he was even some very serious religious sect person. Okay, so somebody says, who's put as their name, would love to get a list of all Julie's excellent recommendations. Says truth is often stranger than fiction. What do you think the literacy legacy will be of the Trump presidential years and rise of right-wing extremist populists? Very good question.
It is an excellent question. I think you're already seeing it. John Lanchester's The Wall, that I quoted on the penultimate slide there, that was longlisted for the prize, and also longlisted for the Booker Prize, the Man Booker of that year, deals very much with that divided country that we saw during, and indeed still see here, about Brexit, and the idea that a country becomes isolationist and inward looking rather than outward looking and open. So I think you're already seeing that permeating out, and Ali Smith's novels also show that. Interestingly, though, it sort of sunk without trace. There was a novel specifically written, which was by Howard Jacobson, when Trump was elected president. It was called Pussy, and I haven't read it. It wasn't very well reviewed, and I suspect that it was written out of rage, rather, you know, than any consideration, or the degree of consideration that one would normally give to writing fiction. But that was written in specific response to Trump's election. I'm sure we'll have many more novels written about not just him, but what's happened after him in the US, and here too. The COVID novel has yet to be written, but also I think novels about the general right-wing leaningness of politics these days.
Indeed, the novelists are going to have to surpass themselves in the near future, because we are living in times that are stranger than fiction. So how do you overcome that? The same person wants to know, apologies if you've already covered this and you have touched upon this. In fact, you had you asked the audience to give you some ideas if they have, but why do you think that there are so few election thrillers in the UK compared to the US?
I really don't know. I was absolutely amazed because I did the research for this article, and I kept thinking, I'm not looking in the right place. There must be some. Elections are inherently dramatic. You know, British writers surely must have written about it. But I just couldn't find any, and I don't know why. I mean, it may be, I guess, that that period of relative stability that I talked about at the outset has led us to be quite complacent about our democracy, it just simply isn't that interesting. I mean, who thinks civics is interesting, though it is necessary? And I think, there was the only other one I think I came across was the J.K. Rowling book, which was The Casual Vacancy, which sort of semi-involved an election to a local county council or a parish council following a death. I came across some interesting ones. There was a book by V.S. Naipaul set in a Trinidadian election, for example. But I simply couldn't find, other than Melanchour and Phineas Redux, I couldn't find any further ones set in a UK election. I just don't know why they're not there. Someone ought to write one.
Exactly. The thoughts of Sally Young, who says, surely Brexit is worth an investigative right. The things that we're going through now, you mentioned COVID as well, they are going to get written about. There are going to be people in the future trying to conjure up these times in their heads, I'm sure. We have quite a lot of questions to go through, so let me, Jax wants to know, so you would have signed the Secrets Act or something, I think, Official Secrets Act, Secrets Act, he means. Does that get in the way of what you can write?
It hasn't. I suppose in theory it could, but it hasn't thus far, because I don't think I've vouchsafed any secrets. And also bear in mind, you know, I've been a writer now for 8 years. So it's 8 years since I left the civil service, and most things will have changed. You know, a week is a short time in politics, someone said. So 8 years is a very long time. I'm not sure that there'll be all that many secrets that I still held that I could give away. Though it is also true that in Plague, I did check the manuscript with the Palace of Westminster, just to make sure that I wasn't giving away any secrets of access, for example, because it's set in the Palace of Westminster and indeed beneath the Palace of Westminster. And I didn't want to in any way imperil the security of the place. So I voluntarily submitted it to the Palace of Westminster to make sure that it wasn't going to give away any of the secrets of access.
So would you have actually changed the descriptions of some spaces so as not to give away, you know, for somebody who potentially might be trolling I don't know how terrorists get their intelligence, but is that the kind of consideration you would put into this?
Well, I think you'd have to. I mean, I don't for 1 minute think that, you know, terrorists are reading my fiction books thinking, no, this will give us a way into the Palace of Westminster. But it's something that one doesn't, you know, one wants to guard against, however outrageous it might seem, and the likelihood of it happening. So yes, I would definitely have changed things. I deliberately wrote, set some of the book in places that don't exist. So there is a security room that features in Plague in the Palace of Westminster, which doesn't exist. There is obviously a central point for security, but I didn't use that at all. I created something that was completely different.
Okay, so Helen wants to know, which political fictional book would you have liked to have written?
Oh, there's a question. I don't really know. I don't think that I have it in me to write the big sort of strategic novels like Brave New World or 1984, or even something like The Handmaid's Tale, which is, I mean, these books are going to live for centuries. But I suspect I'd quite like to write something which is very indicative of wider society, like, say, The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, which was a hugely influential book on the public's mind when it was published. So it would be something. It would be something like that, bringing home to the reader, the wider readership, the plights and travails of the lives in people less fortunate than themselves.
Ordinary people, yes, and they. So it's interesting. Jenny says, in your view, is The Handmaid's Tale purely speculative fiction? Margaret Atwood has said that everything that happens in her novel has happened to women somewhere in the world.
Absolutely.
Chilling, she says, and I must concur, it really is chilling. And you think not just that, but it can happen at any moment, even in the most progressive of societies. It's literally night and day.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, storming the US Capitol building 2 weeks ago, demonstrations on the street. That's how The Handmaid's Tale, that's how Gilead starts in The Handmaid's Tale. You know, and yes, she's right, of course she's right, that, but she brings together experiences that have happened, you know, across the world in lots of different societies, and concentrates them in Gilead, and that's the fictional element. And I think, you know, that she's, of course she's right, elements of it happen everywhere.
Yes, I mean, it's enough if you see the pictures of Iran, Tehran in 1979, and you see all those girls in miniskirts and going studying at universities, and everybody living quite free, and then the change, which was probably for them overnight almost.
Yes, absolutely.
Something on a slightly different note, Sonia wants to know, did you see I, Claudius with Derek Jacobi?
Yes. Yes, I did. I mean, I still think that's a brilliant TV program, I have to say. Although it looks very studio bound now, because, you know, the technology has moved on. The way that TV drama is made is rather different. But the performances are absolutely brilliant. I love Brian Blessed as Augustus, is absolutely wonderful.
Brilliant.
And Sian Phillips as Livia too. I mean, I will always see the older Augustus as Brian Blessed.
That's wonderful. It stayed with me. I was a child, but it stayed with me as something that really uncovered another world in a proper way. Let's see. Kitty says that was a very thoughtful talk. I like how you say that political fiction deepens our understanding and helps us make sense of the world. Where can I get a copy of your book? She's probably, let me just show her where she can do that. I will just put in the slide with the details. So there you go, Kitty. If you want to copy this, just to say, I will send the links, relevant links, in my feedback request, and afterwards. So don't worry, you will get all of this in a clickable format, as it were. So you can just click on it and get to where you want to be. Let's see. Somebody said, what do you think of explicitly ideological novels like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, or Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged?
Yeah, they're interesting, aren't they? I have to say, I often think that the problem with ideological or political fiction, which is driven by ideology, is that they actually end up as not being very good fiction. So Atlas Shrugged is really not that engaging, because it's very, very one-sided. And that's part of the problem with novels that espouse an ideology. If you're going to make it anything like real life, for example, so if you want characters in it who seem real and engaging to the reader, then they have to be believable, and no one goes around spouting, you know, political slogans or exemplifying a political ideology. I mean, in one way, I think that's why The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist sort of doesn't work as a novel, although it's a very influential book, in that, you know, you have these house painters and house decorators essentially taking in Marxist theory whilst they're painting the house. And I'm pretty sure that Trussell wouldn't have published it as a fiction if he were publishing it now. I don't think ideological political fiction works that well as fiction. Now, there are undoubtedly very good writers who can do that, who can make it work. But if you look at the sort of the great writers who created these speculative worlds, like Orwell or Atwood or Huxley, those worlds are not party political. They're of neither right nor left. They are of tyranny and dictatorship and totalitarian nature, the regimes that are depicted in those books. But you couldn't say that they, I mean, you know, 1984, Big Brother could be Stalinist or he could be fascist. You know, it could be right or left wing. And in that sense, the ideology doesn't matter. And I think that's sort of more, that's much more true than books which seek to promulgate one side of the political divide or the other. Now, there'll be people who don't agree with that, I'm sure, but I find that anyway. That's how I respond to those books.
Julie, this brings us to the end of our time. So I think I will finish with a question that nicely tags on to what you were just saying. Kath wants to know which characters are more fun to write about, liberal or conservative?
Well, that depends. I guess I think that the characters that are most fun to write about are the villains. And you can have villains of all sorts of political persuasion. I'm not going to be drawn on whether they're one side of the political spectrum or the other. But I think who was it who said that the scandals that bring down parties are different. With the Labour Party or the left of the spectrum, it's always money that brings down politicians. On the right of the spectrum and the Tory Party, it's always sex. Now, I'm not sure whether that's still true, but the villains are always better to write than the heroes and heroines.
Juicier somehow, much more devious depth to them. Well, Julie, that was incredibly enjoyable. Thank you so much for taking your time and giving us your time tonight. It was really interesting. People are putting in their thanks. I will say good night to everybody who's joined us. We had quite a sizable audience with us tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. Julie, thank you so much. Please, yes.
One thing, I'm actually doing a talk with some colleagues on the 4th of February. The people who, if they've enjoyed this talk, they might enjoy that one. There are tickets available on Eventbrite. It's free. And it's called COVID, Corruption and Crony Capitalism. So it's looking at real life corruption, not the sort that's in Plague, but potentially the sort that's happening now.
Sounds riveting. I can't wait for it. Everybody's welcome. So I will be sending out a feedback form. Please fill it in. And that's good night until the next time. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Nina. Good night. Thank you for listening.